Hi there. Please let your mind slow down and go at ease, and let me know in the comments where you're from. Also, what's your best tip for a peaceful night's sleep and keeping a calm mind? Whether it's a relaxing bedtime ritual, a favorite book, or a mindfulness practice, your advice could be just what someone needs. The hotel phone call. I was traveling for work, and after a long day of meetings and endless driving, I finally checked into a small, outdated hotel on the edge of town. It wasn't exactly the most welcoming place. The wallpaper was peeling, the carpet was worn, and the lights in the hallway flickered every so often. But I was too tired to care. All I wanted was a few hours of sleep before I had to be back on the road. I dropped my bags and collapsed onto the bed, letting out a sigh of relief. The room was eerily quiet, the silence thick and pressing, as though the walls themselves were listening. I turned on the TV, hoping for a bit of background noise to break the silence, but the static crackled on every channel. Frustrated, I turned it off and tried to ignore the strange, unsettling feeling that had crept over me. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, the phone on the bedside table rang. A loud, shrill sound that jolted me awake. I glanced at the clock, 2:33 a.m. Who would be calling at this hour? Groggy and annoyed, I picked up the receiver, holding it to my ear. Hello. At first, there was only silence. Then, slowly, a faint, crackling sound filled the line, like static mixed with a faint hum of distant voices. I strained to listen, trying to make out any words, but the sound was garbled, distorted. I was about to hang up when I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper, barely audible. Don't leave. Stay with us. A chill ran down my spine, and I hung up, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled over me. I told myself it was a prank, maybe someone from another room messing around, but the voice echoed in my mind, each word filled with a strange, haunting urgency. I lay back down, pulling the covers over me, trying to block out the memory of the call. But just as I was about to fall asleep, the phone rang again. I hesitated, my heart pounding, before finally picking it up. Hello, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The line crackled, filled with the same eerie static, and then silence. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear anything. And then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard it. A faint, breathy voice, like someone speaking from the other side of a wall. Stay with us. Don't leave. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking, my pulse racing. The room felt colder, the air thick with a heaviness that pressed down on me, suffocating. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, watching me. But the room was empty, silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. I sat on the edge of the bed, wide awake, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the light. The phone rang a third time, but I didn't answer. I unplugged it, threw it across the room, and lay back down, hoping to forget the voice, to let exhaustion finally take over. But as I lay there, I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck, a whisper so close it felt as though someone were right beside me. Stay. I bolted from the bed, grabbing my things, and running out of the room, my heart pounding as I fled down the hallway. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath, the memory of the voice lingering in my mind, filling me with a bone-deep dread. I drove through the night, desperate to put distance between myself and that hotel. I never looked back, and I refuse to stay in small, deserted hotels now. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the phone ring, faint and insistent, calling me back, reminding me of the voice that pleaded for me to stay. The mirror in the antique shop. There's an old antique shop on the corner of my street, a cluttered, dusty place filled with forgotten relics from another time. The store was dimly lit, with shelves packed tight with oddities, aged photographs, porcelain dolls, tarnished silverware, and paintings that seemed to watch you from the walls. I'd always been drawn to the shop, captivated by its strange charm, its sense of mystery. One day, while browsing, I found a mirror tucked away in the back, leaning against a stack of boxes. It was large, framed in dark, intricately carved wood, its surface clouded with dust. Something about it drew me in, a strange pull that I couldn't ignore. I wiped the dust away, revealing a smooth, polished surface, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something, an image flickering in the glass, a shadow standing just behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but the room was empty. Shaking off the unease, I turned back to the mirror, admiring the craftsmanship. It was beautiful, hauntingly so, and I decided to buy it, thinking it would make a unique addition to my home. I hung the mirror in my living room, and for the first few days, it was fine. But then, strange things started happening. I would catch glimpses of movement in the glass, shadows flickering at the edge of my vision, shapes that vanished as soon as I turned to look. One evening, as I was sitting on the couch, I noticed something unusual in the mirror's reflection. The room was the same, but there was a figure standing in the background, a woman dressed in dark clothing, her face obscured by shadows. She was barely visible, her outline faint and blurred, but unmistakable. I turned around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, leaving only my own reflection staring back at me, my face pale and shaken. Over the next few days, the sightings became more frequent. I would see the woman's figure in the reflection, watching me, her gaze intense, unblinking, filled with a sorrow that made my chest ache. She never moved, never spoke, but her presence was constant, lingering in the glass, haunting me. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a faint, hollow whisper drifting through the silence. I opened my eyes, and there, standing at the foot of my bed, was the woman. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and empty, her expression one of deep, endless sorrow. She stared at me, her gaze unblinking, her lips moving as though she were trying to speak. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me, paralyzing me, but I couldn't look away. Her lips moved faster, her whisper growing louder, filling the room with a soft, echoing chant. "Help me. Free me." Her voice was faint, barely audible, but filled with a desperation that made my chest tighten. I tried to speak, to ask her what she wanted, but the words caught in my throat. The woman took a step closer, her eyes fixed on mine, her whisper filling my mind, overwhelming me. The next thing I remember, I was standing in front of the mirror, my hand pressed against the glass, as though reaching through it. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. The woman was gone, leaving only my own reflection staring back at me, my face pale, my eyes wide with fear. I covered the mirror the next morning, draping it with a heavy cloth. But even now I can feel her presence, sense her gaze, her plea for help echoing in my mind. I can't bring myself to get rid of the mirror, but I can't bear to look at it either. And sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice, faint and desperate, calling to me from behind the glass. The woman on the road. I was driving home late one night, the road empty and silent, stretching on for miles without a single car in sight. The only light came from my headlights, illuminating the winding, narrow road and casting long shadows across the trees that lined the highway. I was tired, my eyes heavy, but I kept going, eager to get home. Just as I rounded a bend, I saw her, a woman standing on the side of the road, her figure barely visible in the darkness. She was dressed in a long, pale dress that fluttered in the wind, her hair loose and tangled. She looked lost, her gaze fixed on something in the distance, her arms wrapped around herself as though she were cold. I slowed down, pulling over to the side of the road. It was late, and the stretch of highway was desolate. I couldn't just leave her there. I rolled down my window, calling out to her, but she didn't respond. She didn't even seem to notice me. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and there was a sadness in her eyes, a deep, haunting sorrow that made my chest ache. I called out again, louder this time, and she turned slowly, her gaze meeting mine. Her eyes were dark, empty, filled with an emptiness that sent a chill down my spine. She took a step toward me, her movements slow, deliberate, each one sending a wave of dread washing over me. "Do you need help?" I managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable, her gaze piercing, and then, slowly, she shook her head. Her lips parted as though she were about to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she reached out, her hand hovering just above the car door, her fingers trembling. I felt an overwhelming urge to drive away, to put as much distance between us as possible, but I couldn't move, couldn't tear my gaze from her. She took another step, her face inches from mine, her eyes filled with that same haunting sorrow. And then, in a voice barely audible, she whispered, "Don't go down that road." Her words sent a jolt of fear through me, and I pulled back, my mind racing. Before I could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the darkness as though she'd never been there at all. The road was empty, silent, stretching on in eerie stillness. Shaken, I continued driving, her warning echoing in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been real, that her sorrow, her warning, held a truth I didn't fully understand. As I drove, the road grew narrower, the trees closing in around me, casting shadows that seemed to shift and move in the corners of my vision. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that something terrible awaited me just around the next bend. Then, as I rounded the corner, I saw it. A car, crushed and overturned, lying in the ditch at the side of the road. My heart pounded as I pulled over, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. But when I stepped out of the car, I froze. There, among the wreckage, was a dress, a long, pale dress, torn and stained, fluttering in the breeze. I backed away, my mind reeling, and in the silence I heard her voice, faint and distant, her warning echoing in the night. Don't go down that road. I fled, driving through the night, her words haunting me, filling me with a dread I couldn't shake. And now, every time I pass that stretch of highway, I see her, a faint, ghostly figure standing by the side of the road, her sorrowful gaze fixed on me, her silent warning echoing in the darkness. The Whispering Doll. When I was a child, my grandmother gave me a doll, a beautiful, old-fashioned porcelain doll with glassy blue eyes, golden curls, and a delicate pink dress. I was captivated by her, drawn to the lifelike detail, the way her eyes seemed to sparkle in the light. My grandmother told me the doll had been in the family for generations, passed down from one child to the next, and now it was mine. I loved that doll, carrying her with me everywhere, playing with her for hours. But as I grew older, I started to notice strange things about her. Sometimes, when I left her in one spot, I returned to find her in a different position. Her head tilted, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, like a breathy voice murmuring in the darkness. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, filling the room, and I realized it was coming from the doll. Her lips moving ever so slightly, her eyes fixed on me. Don't leave me, she whispered, her voice faint, childlike, filled with a sadness that sent chills down my spine. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that it was just a dream, but the whispers continued, night after night. Each time they grew louder, more insistent, her pleas filling my mind, echoing in the silence until I could no longer ignore them. One night, desperate for answers, I picked her up, holding her close, my hands shaking. "What do you want?" I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. Her gaze seemed to soften, her eyes glinting in the dim light, and in that moment I felt something, a weight, a presence, something trapped within her glassy gaze. She looked at me, her expression filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to reach into my soul. "Don't leave me," she whispered again, her voice trembling, filled with a desperation that made my chest ache. I tried to get rid of the doll, placing her in a box in the attic, hoping that distance would make the whispers stop. But that night, I heard it again, a faint, muffled whisper drifting down from the attic, filling the house with a hollow, haunting sound. I could feel her presence lingering just above me, her voice growing louder, more insistent, her pleas echoing in my mind, begging me to come back, to let her out. The air grew colder, the house filled with a heavy, oppressive silence, and I knew, deep down, that she would never let me go. I tried to ignore her, to move on, but the whispers followed me, haunting me, filling my mind with her pleas, her desperation. I could feel her presence everywhere, in the shadows, in the corners of the room. Her gaze watching, waiting, her sorrow seeping into every part of my life. And now, even years later, I can still hear her voice faint but constant, her plea echoing in the darkness, a reminder of the doll I tried to forget. Don't leave me. The voice in the cabin. Last winter, I rented a remote cabin deep in the woods, hoping for a quiet getaway where I could unwind and enjoy the silence. The cabin was rustic, old-fashioned, surrounded by tall pines and a dense blanket of snow that muffled every sound. It felt like I was the only person in the world, isolated from everything. And for the first few days, it was perfect. But then, strange things began to happen. At night, I would hear noises outside, faint footsteps crunching in the snow, a soft shuffling that grew louder and faded away, as though someone were circling the cabin. I told myself it was just animals, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, creeping over me like a chill. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper, drifting through the silence. It was faint, like someone standing just outside the door, calling out in a voice filled with sorrow. I sat up, straining to listen, and the whisper grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a haunting, breathy sound. "Come out," it whispered, the words drawn out, lingering in the air. I froze, my heart pounding, staring at the door, half expecting it to swing open. The voice continued, its tone desperate, pleading, filling me with a dread that seemed to sink into my bones. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard it, but the voice grew louder, each word echoing in the silence. "Please, come out." I stood, heart racing, and approached the door, peering through the small, frosted window. But all I could see was the empty forest, the trees casting long shadows over the snow. The whisper stopped, leaving only silence, but I felt its presence, a weight pressing down on me, as though someone, or something, were just outside, watching, waiting. I locked the door, shoving a chair against it, and returned to bed, pulling the covers over me, too terrified to move. The night was silent, oppressive, the air heavy with a sense of dread that made it impossible to sleep. The next night, the whispers returned, louder this time, calling to me from the darkness. They drifted through the walls, filling the room with an eerie, echoing sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Please, let me in." The voice was filled with sorrow, a longing that made my heart ache, but it was laced with something darker, a hint of malice that sent a chill down my spine. I sat up, my mind racing, wondering if I was imagining things, if the isolation had finally gotten to me. But then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It started at the front door, then moved to the windows, circling the cabin, filling the air with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The voice continued, its tone pleading, desperate. "Let me in. Don't leave me out here." I backed away, clutching a blanket around me, my eyes fixed on the door. I could see a faint shadow just beyond the window, a figure standing in the snow, watching, waiting. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, heart pounding, as the shadow moved closer, pressing against the glass, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "Let me in." I spent the night huddled in the corner, too terrified to move, listening to the voice, the scraping, the slow, deliberate footsteps that circled the cabin until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I gathered my things, threw them in the car, and left, my heart racing as I sped down the snowy road. But even now, months later, I can still hear the voice, faint but constant, echoing in my mind, pleading for me to come back, to let it in. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake to the sound of soft whispers drifting through the walls, a reminder of the shadow that waits for me, hidden in the depths of the forest, the neighbor's window. When I moved into my new apartment, I was happy to find it had a view of the neighboring building, a beautiful old brownstone with tall windows and ornate balconies. At first, I didn't think much of it. The view was quaint, charming, and I enjoyed watching the daily lives of the residents as they went about their routines. But then, one night, I noticed something strange. There was a woman in the window of the apartment directly across from mine, standing in the shadows, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She was dressed in white, her long hair cascading over her shoulders, her gaze fixed on something outside. I watched her for a few moments, expecting her to move, but she remained still, staring out the window with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I told myself it was nothing, just a late-night reverie. But as the days passed, I noticed her more frequently. She was always there, standing in the same spot, her face obscured by shadows, her gaze unblinking, unmoving. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself drawn to the window again, my eyes searching for her figure in the darkness. She was there, as usual, her silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of a streetlight, her gaze distant, fixed on some invisible point beyond the glass. But then, as I watched, she turned, her face slowly coming into view. Her eyes met mine, piercing, intense, filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. I stumbled back, startled, my heart racing, but I couldn't look away. She held my gaze, her expression one of sadness, pleading, as though she were trying to convey something urgent. The next night, I watched again, feeling drawn to her, unable to resist. She was there, waiting, her gaze fixed on my window. And this time, she raised a hand, pressing her fingers against the glass, her expression shifting to one of desperation. "Help me," she mouthed, the words barely visible, but unmistakable. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away, closing the curtains, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. But her face lingered in my mind, her desperate plea filling my thoughts, haunting me. The next morning, I decided to find out more about her. I asked the building manager if he knew anything about the woman in the neighboring apartment, but he looked at me with a blank expression, as though I were speaking nonsense. "There's no one in that apartment," he said slowly, his tone laced with confusion. "That unit's been empty for years." I felt a wave of disbelief, my mind reeling, but he was insistent. The apartment was vacant, had been for a long time, and there was no record of anyone living there in recent memory. I went back to my apartment, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I couldn't understand it, couldn't make sense of what I'd seen. That night, I couldn't resist. I stood by the window, staring at her apartment, waiting, hoping it had all been a trick of the light, my imagination playing games. But as the hours passed, I saw her again. Standing in the window, her face filled with that same sorrow, that same pleading expression. She raised her hand, pressing it against the glass, her eyes locked onto mine, filled with a silent, desperate plea. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, and I backed away, closing the curtains, trying to block out her gaze. I moved out shortly after, unable to bear the feeling of being watched, the memory of her sorrowful face haunting me. But sometimes, when I walk past that building, I glance up, half expecting to see her, her figure silhouetted in the window, waiting, watching, her silent plea echoing in my mind. And every now and then I see her, a faint shadow in the window, her gaze fixed on me, a reminder of the plea I ignored, the woman I left behind in the darkness.